So just quickly, Maine Lakes, we are a statewide lake conservation organization. Our flagship program is Lake Smart. We work with homeowners to get them to implement best practices that reduce pollution and erosion on their property. We support our lake association members with a lot of different resources and support systems. We have a Lakes Alive outdoor education program. It's on hiatus this summer because of our inability to get together with groups on boats, but stay tuned. That program is going under some review and revision. And we do advocacy in both Augusta and DC on clean water issues. So find out more about us at mainelakesociety.org. So getting to why you're all here today. We, as I mentioned, Scott Williams and Roberta Hill are joining us as speakers. There they are. For anybody who's panicked because they're in the same room together inside, Scott and Roberta have been married for quite some time, so they are immune from our social distancing requirements. Scott has been the executive director at Lake Stewards of Maine for more than 20 years. He is an aquatic biologist and limnologist with more than 4 decades of experience working on the assessment and protection of hundreds of lakes and ponds throughout Maine. He's been an advisor and a consultant to all kinds of groups, associations, towns, you name it, he has advised. He's also the past president and a longtime science advisor for Maine Lake, so we thank him for that. And he is a member of Maine's Task Force on Invasive Aquatic Species and serves on lots of technical and advisory committees and looking at water quality protection standards for the state of Maine. So thank you, Scott, for all the work you do. Roberta is the Invasive Species Program Director at Lake Stewards of Maine. She's an aquatic ecologist and environmental educator, and she has been active in the field of lake protection and community outreach in Maine for over 20 years. She's led community-based projects that have ranged from watershed surveys to non-point source remediation to invasive aquatic plant monitoring. She's also been instrumental in the creation and development of some of Maine's most successful and long-standing lake education programs, including, which I'm sure she'll talk about today, the LSM's invasive plant control. So thank you, Roberta. Maine Lakes, Maine Lake Society benefits greatly from our collaboration with our colleagues at Lake Stewards of Maine on a variety of fronts, and we are continuing to work more closely together on more lake issues in the coming years. So it's great. It's just fantastic to have their expertise. We're both statewide lake organizations, but we both have different areas that we focus on, and we work really well together. So I'm always happy to work with Lake Stewards of Maine, and without further ado, I will give my screen over to Scott and Roberta.
Thank you very much, Susan. While I'm sharing my screen, I would just like to also concur that we very much value, I'll play from start, our relationship with Maine Lakes. And we're just delighted to be here with you, Susan and Drew, and thank you so much for inviting us to participate in what can only be characterized as a tremendously successful webinar series. And so we'll do our best to uphold that standard that you have now set. And just want to welcome everybody to the webinar. And we are grateful that you signed on and brought us into your house and homes. And as we are all pretty much operating from our safe places at this point, we hope you all are well. And we're here to talk to you about something that we live and breathe all the time. And as a couple, we can hardly get away from it. And it's something that we love, and it's the Lake Stewards of Maine, or what used to be called the Maine Volunteer Lake Monitoring Program. Oops, hang on one second. There we go. The mission of our organization is fairly straightforward. Like many lake groups in Maine, we are working to protect Maine lakes, but we do it through a very specific way, and that's by engaging citizens in the gathering and dissemination of credible scientific information pertaining to lake health. The Lake Stewards of Maine is the oldest and one of the largest statewide citizen lake monitoring programs in the United States. We provide training and technical support to thousands of volunteer citizen scientists all across the state. We now have about, or over, I would say, 1,200 certified citizen lake monitors, monitoring roughly 500 of Maine's lakes. And geographically, we are certainly the primary collector of data pertaining to the lakes of Maine. You can see from this map that our volunteers are scattered across the state. However, most of them are concentrated in the lower half of the state, where most of the population is also concentrated. And we are continually working to push our way north and to get more and more monitoring going on up there. And there are good reasons for doing so. Those lakes are just as vulnerable as our southern lakes, and they need also careful monitoring. And now Scott will talk about the threats to our lakes.
And I'll just reiterate what Roberta said earlier. Thanks to all of you for being here today. Whoever you are, we don't really know, but we're looking forward to finding out at some point. If I, during the course of speaking today or in the background, if you hear me coughing or sneezing, I don't have the virus, but I am afflicted with spring allergies, as many people are this time of the year. As part of building the case for support, if you will, for how important a role citizen lake scientists play in protecting our lakes in Maine, I would just like to briefly review some information regarding the threats to our lakes. These are known threats. Most of you are probably familiar with some or all of them. So we'll just quickly go through these. Each of these could basically be a webinar unto itself. So it's going to be a very brief discussion. And the first is acid rain, which we heard a lot about back in the 1970s, but you don't really hear much about today. And that is thanks to the effectiveness of the Federal Clean Water Act, which has greatly reduced the, Clean Air Act, which has greatly reduced the pollutants that were associated with the acidification of some lakes and ponds in certain areas of the world, and also here in the Northeast, other areas of the world and in the Northeast. And most of that pollution was coming from coal-fired power plants and the like, traveling hundreds or thousands of miles. Well, thanks to the effectiveness of the Clean Air Act, the only lakes today that really are experiencing any significant acidification are those that are situated at relatively high elevation. This is a photograph of the bowl, as it's referred to in Acadia National Park. High elevation lakes, the soils are typically less well buffered against shift in pH. So this is not something that we focus much on in this program, but it is certainly a threat. And let's hope that the Clean Air Act continues to do its job in the future. I wonder how many of you are aware of the fact that Maine has at this point, relatively long-standing fish consumption advisory in place as a result of mercury contamination and the bioaccumulation of mercury in fish tissue. This is something that's pretty serious. I don't think it gets nearly enough attention or press. It is statewide, and we've all our lives, most of us, been accustomed to eating fish from freshwater resources, and now we need to be paying attention to the fact that especially if we're in a sensitive age group, that can have a negative effect on our health as a result of mercury contamination. This is another issue which is not easy to deal with at the local level because the source of mercury is again, typically coal-fired power plants and also municipal incinerators. So the contaminants may be traveling hundreds or thousands of miles. Whoops, I'll get this eventually. I think that invasive aquatic species are pretty high on everybody's radar screen in Maine now, thanks to the efforts of several groups and state agencies that have made a concerted effort in recent years to make people aware of the fact that this threat of invasive aquatic plants and animals is real. It is affecting some of our lakes in Maine, although Maine has a relatively small, a very small percentage of its lakes in total known to be infested with an aquatic invader. But it is something that if your lake is fortunate enough not to have an invasive aquatic species, that's great, but don't be lulled into a sense of false security, because it can happen virtually overnight and spread very rapidly. The loss of habitat, whether it's caused by the incremental development in a lake watershed, and which includes the shoreline area, of course, can have a negative effect on lakes over a period of time. The natural vegetation that occurs in lake watersheds and that surrounds the shorelines of our lakes serves as a protective filter. And as those filters are replaced by buildings and roads and so forth, what we refer to collectively as impervious surfaces, the potential for a reduction in that natural layer of protection takes place. Aquatic invaders can also change the habitat of a lake quite dramatically through dominating the flora or the fauna, or both. And so this is something that people often don't think about as a threat, but it's certainly something we should be paying attention to. And then there's climate change. The fact that our climate is warming, that as a result, that is likely to have a profound impact on lakes over time. One of the most common effects of climate change that we're already seeing and measuring is the shortening of the duration of ice cover on both ends of the ice continuum, if you will, in the fall and the spring. It varies a lot from one year to the next, as the graphic on the middle left shows. But there have been multiple studies now that have shown significant trends that are occurring in this respect. The increase in the frequency of severe storm events also has a negative impact on lakes, the most obvious effect of which is more soil erosion taking place. And eroded soil, once it gets into a lake, can have a negative impact in one of a number of ways. But the most pervasive of all of the problems that our lakes face is polluted stormwater runoff from watershed development. Again, as that natural filter is replaced, you can see in this picture of the shoreline, a lake shoreline, that filter is largely missing, that last critical barrier. Anywhere where there is development taking place in a lake watershed, there is likely to be, or there is the potential for there to be polluted stormwater runoff that finds its way to the lake eventually and has an impact. And this can take place anywhere in the watershed, certainly not just on the shoreline. It's not just residential development, it can be commercial development, agriculture. The potential for polluted runoff is there, and it's significant, and it's quite pervasive in Maine. So the challenge that we face in protecting our lakes, the thousands of lakes that we have here in Maine, which are some of the clearest and cleanest in the world, is that not only are there lots of them, but everyone is unique. I've been working with lakes now for multiple decades, and it would be easy to characterize them as having a lot of traits in common, which of course they do, but they're also very unique. And I have some great stories, which I won't get into right now, of how different lakes can be from each other, even if they're situated in very close proximity. So to keep our lakes clean over a period of time, we need to understand not only the threats, but to monitor their health over time, and so that we can better understand how they respond to the threats and what therefore can be done to help protect them. And a very quick history of the organization. We were formed in 1971. by a small group of visionaries, one of whom is Matt Scott, who's shown in the upper photograph on the right with the giant Secchi disc. He received as an award, but Matt was the first biologist to be hired at the newly formed Maine Department of Environmental Protection, and he formed the State of Maine's Lakes program there. And Matt and his colleagues and friends realized that with the number of lakes that we have in Maine, professionals would never be able to have there would never be public resources through the state agencies to be able to watch over all of our lakes. There was a need to engage the public. And so at that time, the volunteer monitoring program, as it was first referred to, was formed and managed by the Maine Department of Environmental Protection. And that agency managed the program very well through the mid-1990s, at which time a transition took place in which the organization became a private nonprofit organization, but we still work very closely with the DEP and others. As a result of that transition, the program has expanded quite substantially. We currently have about 1,300 certified lake monitors in the state of Maine, monitoring approximately 500 lakes. Our program goals are pretty straightforward. We basically are a citizen science-based lake monitoring system. We have established such a system over the past nearly 50 years now. Another very important goal is, which I'll talk about a little bit later, scientifically credible lake data. We're not out there just gathering any old data. We're gathering data that we can be able to assure people are credible. Fostering public engagement in the protection and monitoring of our lakes, and stewardship and leadership are also important goals. And ultimately, we have a goal of putting a steward or monitor watching the health of every Maine lake. So how are we going to achieve these goals? And Roberta is going to speak a little bit about that.
So how we do achieve the goals, one of the primary ways is through collaboration. The Lake Stewards of Maine is truly a collaborative enterprise to the core. We couldn't function without our collaborators, and we feel that we are accomplishing our mission when we can help our collaborators accomplish their missions. And we feel that that is the very best strategy for being successful. We, as Scott already mentioned, we collaborate with state agencies, in particular the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, where we got our start. And we have a very strong public-private partnership with the DEP providing technical assistance, some funding, the overarching programmatic goals that we share. And then we're able to do a lot of the liaisoning with the volunteers, the technical assistance for our volunteers, bring in additional sources of funding and so on. So it's a very fruitful collaboration with the state. We also collaborate with researchers doing lake research in Maine. This is an example. This is Dr. Holly Ewing. She's based out of Bates College. And Holly has been doing tremendous work on studying gliotrichia, one of the cyanobacteria or blue-green algae that's natural in our lakes, but has seemed to be kind of changing its behavior to some degree in the last couple of decades. And Holly is doing research on that, and not only Lake Stewards of Maine, but our volunteers are helping her to collect the essential data to get her work done. Another example, Steve Norton and Professor Amir Bahman, sorry. And both of these folks have been working through the University of Maine. Arya recently left. We lost him to a school in California, but he is still on our advisory board and we're still in touch. And they've been doing very important work on lake sediment core analysis to determine why some lakes are more vulnerable to the nutrient phosphorus and that eutrophication process than others. And we've been able, again, to help them by putting them in touch with volunteers on lakes that they want to study, where they can go out and do their core samples and so on. And then these are just a list of some of our other collaborators, other agencies, Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, other conservation non-governmental organizations such as Maine Lakes, Lakes Environmental Association, Raymond Waterways Protective Association, et cetera, et cetera. Soil water conservation districts across the state, water utilities, the Indian tribes, educational institutions, civic groups, businesses, municipalities. And we have also been working with our neighbors in Canada in several different provinces to help them adopt our model for citizen lake science in their provinces. So we're really proud that we have been used in such a way, and we're very willing to share that information. By far, our most important collaborator are our volunteers, our citizen lake scientists. They are the heart and soul of this organization. It would absolutely not exist without them. And they bring so much to the enterprise. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few moments, but they really are what make this program very unique and very special to all of us. They're what keep us going. Another very important way we are able to be successful at this work is through what Scott already mentioned as our very strict adherence to quality assurance and quality control, and he will go over some of the details of that.
So whether any organization or agency or entity that is gathering data to be used for research knows that quality assurance is an essential and vital element of the process. Without a strict and very clearly defined quality assurance program in place, we would not be able to assure all of the users of volunteer data of its value, of its credibility. And there would be little or no point to doing what we and all of our volunteers are doing as a result. There are many elements to the quality assurance and quality control process. We provide all volunteers with comprehensive training. We tell them not only how to go about gathering data, but why they're doing it, how to interpret the data when they have it, how to recognize when something doesn't look right. We've established standards for certification of all of our volunteers. And in order for their data to be accepted and used, they have to become certified, and they have to adhere to certification standards over time. We provide all of our volunteers with lifetime technical support as soon as they've gone through the training process and have achieved their certification. We provide them with technical support throughout the year. Education and network, multiple level quality assurance check systems that we have in place, routine program evaluation by others, all part of this process of ensuring the quality of the information. We standardize and clearly have in place all the protocols, the technical resources, the documentation forms, and so forth, all toward being able to help assure users of the information of its credibility over time. And this is a graphic from a study that was done by Dan Canfield and his colleagues in the Florida Lake Watch program. And their program is structured very much like ours in terms of training and support of their volunteers. And a number of years ago, they looked at the relationship between data gathered by volunteers in their program and data gathered by professional lake scientists. They did side-by-side comparisons. And this is a graphic for the one particular aspect of data collection, Secchi transparency, measuring how clear the water is using a Secchi disk. And without going into details, basically what the study showed was that the data were indistinguishable. You could not tell the difference between the volunteer and the professional data, and that's exactly the way we want it to be. And because we do have a high level of quality assurance for the organization, for the program, Our data are used and valued by the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, the US EPA, research agencies and institutions throughout the country, lake and watershed groups, soil and water conservation districts, and many more. So what do our volunteers actually do? Well, they monitor a wide range of indicators of water quality. Too much to go into in any detail, but in the upper center there, you see an individual leaning over the boat looking through what's called a monitoring scope, looking at a Secchi disc, which he's about to lower down into the water to determine how clear it is. And lake clarity or transparency is actually a very good indicator of overall lake water quality. We also have a component involving watershed assessment, where volunteers are trained to go out, and citizen lake scientists are trained to go out and assess their watersheds, identify problems that exist there, help make recommendations to resolve them over time and further protect the lake. We screen lakes for invasive aquatic plants and animals, a big part of what the organization does. You can see in the upper right, an individual who's conducting a screening survey from a kayak. Typically, these surveys are done by groups in lake communities. They also conduct inventories of native aquatic plants, which is information that is not well known for many of our lakes in Maine and is very valuable in helping us understand and protect them. Our volunteers are helping to track the effects of climate change on lakes. One very simple way that they are doing that is simply by helping to track ice out days and ice on days as well, among other things. Many of our volunteers develop and lead conservation efforts in their lake communities, such as watershed surveys, and many of them also play key leadership roles in communities and in this organization, Lake Stewards of Maine. And this graphic just very quickly looks primarily at indicators of water quality. And this was last updated in 2017. And the deep red or whatever that color is, maroon bars show the percentage of data gathered in 2017 by state agencies, primarily the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, the lake data gathered. And the lighter colored bars underneath show the data gathered by volunteers within this organization. And as you can see, citizen lake science added very substantially to the information and knowledge of the data gathered that year. And this is not in any way to suggest that the DEP is not doing its job. They do a great job with the resources that they have and the staff that they have. But volunteers, citizen lake scientists can make a huge difference. And one of the really important differences that our volunteers make, typically our lake stewards, citizen scientists are members of a lake community. And very often they actually perhaps have a piece of shorefront property. They've spent time on the body of water that they monitor, often many decades. And they have a pretty good sense for what is normal and what's not normal. And therefore, they're in a very good position to recognize when something has changed, something unusual is happening. And that ability to detect a problem early is so essential to an effective and rapid response to the problem over time. So this is a very, very important role that our volunteers play. But there are important things too beyond the actual gathering of data that Roberta is going to address now.
So we kind of, at one point, tried to sit down and characterize the traits of our volunteers, some traits that they shared in common. You know, what makes a lake steward a lake steward? What do they have? What is it about them? And these are some of the traits. These are some very important traits that we came up with on our list, and there are more. But one is that across the board, these folks are passionate about the lakes that they love. They love them, they want to know more about them, and they want to protect them. And this is a great example of one of those passionate volunteers. This is our Uber Ipper Invasive Plant Patrol is the name of our invasive plant survey program. And so IPP Ipper, so he is our Uber Ipper, Dennis Roberta, and he has a place on Massam Lake, and he has been monitoring it for years. But one year he was determined to do the entirety of the shore, basically snorkeling and dragging along behind him a like 14-foot boat for safety and for hauling his materials and supplies along behind him as well. So it was a tremendous labor. It only has about 23 miles of shoreline, but it's a very convoluted shoreline with a lot of shallow area that he had to zigzag back and forth across. So he estimates that he covered about 100 miles that year snorkeling with the boat in tow, entirely solo. So that's a sense of the passion. Our volunteers are determined to get the job done. This is a great example of that. This is, again, a group of Uber Ippers. This is the Moosehead crew, or part of the Moosehead crew. The team did fluctuate between 12 and 20 members over a 6-year period, 5 of which we were active on the lake. But only 23 survey days on the water over that period. So not a lot of days. We were able to, again, survey the entirety of the littoral zone of Moosehead Lake. Again, Moosehead Lake has 300 miles of shoreline, but a lot more area, you know, that is littoral that needs to be zigzagged across. So again, it's tremendous labor. There were lots of logistics to work out, and we had just a very excellent team. Each team member kind of bringing a different quality onto the. Oops, sorry.
Missed it.
Oh, you did miss it.
It's okay.
We had a poll for you. Yeah, it's not too late.
No, it's not.
We're going to launch a poll. We missed our cue. And the question is, have you ever participated in some aspect of citizen lake science? We'd love to see how many among you have. This is fascinating. And it looks like we have about 76 of you on the call right now. So, and 75% of you have done some kind of citizen lake monitoring. So that's wonderful. And those of you who said no, we're hoping by the time you go all the way through this talk that you might get inspired to join in. So thank you for doing that, Drew. That's excellent. Can we get rid of the poll? Is it still there? Am I sharing the results? Oh, so there. I don't know. I guess I could get rid of that. Okay. I have never done a poll before, so learning curve. Another quality that our volunteers seem to share in common is that these folks are lifelong learners, and they are not only lifelong learners, but they're very eager to share their knowledge, not the knowledge that they came to the program with before they became volunteers, as well as the knowledge and skills that they've gained since they have been with us. And this is an example. Ross Westcott Standing is teaching other lake team leaders, invasive plant patrol team leaders, how to construct view scopes that they can take that information back to their teams and have their own view scope clinics with their team members. So to skip one, and just a can-do spirit. Roll up your sleeves. Don't wait for somebody else to do it. That kind of spirit seems to be dominant amongst our volunteers. Our volunteers are impactful in their communities, around their lakes, within their family groups and neighborhoods, and they're impactful as far as all of our lakes of Maine are concerned. And this is a great example of that. Dick Butterfield, who attended one invasive plant patrol workshop in 2008, went out to do his first survey just right along the shoreline where he lived, kind of the central part of Damascotta Lake. He ducked into a little cove. If you can see the picture on the left of the, there's some water shield there and some water lilies, but he had been trained to look down below the surface plants which he did. He pulled up what he saw from below. He recognized that this has a plant with whorls. I need to count those whorls. If there's more than leaves per whorl, that's something to be suspicious of. And he did find more than three leaves per whorl. He sent the plant to us just as he had been taught. We were able to look at it within a day or two, and we knew it was hydrilla, which is considered the worst of the worst invasive aquatic plant worldwide, right here on Damariscotta Lake. And Dick Butterfield basically saved Damariscotta Lake from an economic and ecological disaster because it was found very, very early in a small cove where it has been controlled and will probably be fully eradicated. So that's just a great success story. Another important characteristic is that these are dedicated folks. They are, we know this because every year at our annual conference, we provide awards. We actually do it at 5-year increment intervals. We give them an award for their 5-year mark, their 10-year, and so on. And we now have a number of people coming in at the 40-year of dedicated service achievement. So again, that's kind of extraordinary when you consider that most volunteer programs, the average length of time that a person does volunteer for any endeavor is usually between 3 and 5 years. So we have tremendously dedicated folks. So in summing up, much of what we know about our beautiful, clear, clean, but vulnerable lakes here in Maine is a result of the work of people that we've just been telling you about, and people just like all of you. And we thank each and every one of you who's already doing this work, and we welcome those of you who are yet to join. Any parting words?
And that is our very quick overview of the work of Lake Stewards of Maine. If you have questions about the organization, we'd be happy to try to answer them. If we don't do it here today, feel free to contact us anytime by phone or email or whatever works best for you. There's a lot more to share with you, but we're very happy to have had this opportunity, and we're appreciative to Maine Lakes for inviting us and hosting the event.
Thank you so much, both Roberta and Scott. Really appreciate the presentation and the great information. It's really inspiring to see your volunteers, both the effort of individuals and the length of time that people have dedicated to water quality monitoring in Maine is just really, really impressive. We have a couple questions here. If anybody, like Scott mentioned, you know, we have a few minutes we have about 5 minutes for questions. If you have a question, just type it into the Q&A box. We're not, somebody's raised their hands, but we're not using that feature today, but type it in if you can into the question box, and we'll try to get to it. So we'll get to as many as we can. And in the past, Scott and Roberta, we've, and I don't think there'll be an overwhelming number of questions. If there's questions that we don't get to, we'll send them to you, and
we'll do
when we do a follow-up. When we do a follow-up email, we can hopefully send along some additional answers. So somebody would like to know about the plan for invasive milfoil in Big Lake.
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. And in fact, there is going to be a webinar, and I don't have the date on the tip of my tongue, but you can contact us and I'll give it to you. It's on our Facebook page. I know that. That gets you onto our Facebook page, but it's coming up soon. That we'll be going over that in more detail. But in a nutshell, we were fully prepared this year. We'd already met in January to start strategizing our response to the Big Lake infestation. The first thing when any lake is found to be infested with a new infestation is to survey the entirety of the lake so that we know the extent of the infestation. That has to be done. It's critically important. And because of COVID, and not so much that the survey work would be impossible with social distancing, it's probably theoretically possible, but because we would all be traveling from away into a part of the state where the infection is low. And we would, so that's a risk in itself. And then we would be cohabitating or habitating in close proximity, and eating would be going out to eat and that kind of thing. It was too problematic and too unsafe. So we've had to postpone that. But in the meantime, there have been some warning buoys placed where we know the plants are. We don't know the full extent, but where we know they are, those 3 big patches have been clearly marked, asking people to stay out. And then we have warning signs at the boat landings, the public boat landings. They have a courtesy boat inspection program that they are getting up and running there this year. And we are going to be doing some workshops with the local people, teaching them how to be on the lookout for milfoil. And I think the locals can do actually quite a lot. So we're very hopeful that this is going to move forward. We had a bit of a stumbling block, but we'll keep helping as much as we can. And thank you for any of you who signed on today who had signed on to be part of that Big Lakes team. Special thanks to you, because we know it is a big deal, and beyond standby though, because it'll happen, hopefully next year.
Terrific. Well, it's good to know that things are happening in the meantime. So a quick question. Here's a question about development. Can you speak to the relative impacts of agriculture development versus residential commercial development in a Maine watershed? Do you think, yeah?
Well, historically, there's no question agriculture had a potentially negative impact on our lakes back before we really understood, the relationship between lake water quality changes over time and what was happening in the watershed. In recent years, for a number of reasons, agriculture, the impact of agriculture has been less overall statewide, simply because there are fewer and fewer active farms in the state, and there's more and more residential development taking place. Acre for acre, agriculture has the potential to have more of an impact probably than most residential development, but most active commercial farms these days are working with soil and water conservation districts and others, and they are using best management practices, conservation practices to minimize the effect of farming activity on lakes. And the same can be said to some extent of development, especially new development. A lot of existing development is still unaddressed. So, there's not a real clear-cut answer to that question, but it's certainly the Lake Smart program, which Susan mentioned earlier, which has been such an important part of Maine lakes, is one way of going out and identifying problems that need to be resolved along the shorelines of the Maine lakes and the upland areas as well, as our citizen lake watershed surveys, which we've been involved with for many years. So yeah, any land use in the watershed has the potential to have a negative effect if appropriate conservation practices are not being used.
Yeah, true.
And one last bit on that is that what were appropriate conservation practices a decade or so ago are no longer appropriate, because we have much more precipitation in Maine and more frequent extreme storm events. So if you've got a culvert in that was placed 20 years ago, you might want to make sure that it's properly sized, in other words, for the current scenario.
So it's not so much that it's not appropriate, but it's inadequate. A vegetative buffer that might have been effective or adequate prior to the effects of climate change that we're seeing, the intense weather events, extreme weather events, might not be sufficient now. And Roberta just gave another good example. Many municipalities throughout Maine are in the process of working with the Department of Agriculture, Soil and Water Conservation Districts to enlarge the capacity of their culvert systems, municipal culvert systems, which are easily overwhelmed by these big storm events. And with that comes a lot of soil erosion. And if the culverts are situated in a lake watershed, that can have certainly a negative effect.
Yeah, we're struggling, we're wrestling with that for Lake Smart and trying to think, define, looking at our buffers and some other things to say, are these really adequate today? They will, in light of those exact same things. Well, I'll do one more quick question. We're just a little bit over time, so I think people are starting to trickle off the webinar, so we do try to wrap up. But I think there's probably 10 or 11 questions we will not get to, but I thought this one was interesting. If you had to choose 3 lake monitoring parameters, sort of most important for water quality, what would they be?
Well, the one that I think probably comes to most people's mind right away is Secchi disc transparency. This remarkably simple device, this 8-inch hatched disc attached to a measuring tape that can be lowered down into the water and until it disappears, and the distance or the depth at which it disappears is recorded. And there's more to it than that. But it's a relatively simple and very inexpensive process that you get the results instantaneously. You don't have to wait for a lab report to come back. And it's used universally. This is a tool that has been used by people studying lakes for a long, long time throughout the entire world. So there's a lot of comparable data to share. So that would be at the top of my list, certainly, because it's so easy to train somebody to use a Secchi disc, and the equipment cost is minimal, and let's see, 2 more. Well, if we're talking about water quality, another important indicator is dissolved oxygen, because dissolved oxygen, or DO as we refer to it, is a very sensitive indicator of a stressed lake system over a period of time. It's not quite as easy to monitor because it does involve the use of fairly sophisticated and not inexpensive equipment, but a lake community can come together, typically a lake association, and usually come up with the resources to enable volunteers who are willing to go through the training to use the device and to use it very effectively. Another very simple measure, but critically important, I think probably most people who are here today know that the pollutant that we're most concerned about with lakes is the nutrient phosphorus. Phosphorus is what's referred to as the limiting nutrient in lake biological productivity, and it takes very little phosphorus added to lake water to cause a fairly dramatic increase in the growth of algae, which has all kinds of implications. So phosphorus can be measured fairly easily. When we train new volunteers to take Secchi disc readings, we also train them to take what's called a subsurface total phosphorus grab sample, in which they simply take an appropriate container that they receive from a laboratory, dip it down below the surface, take the sample, ship it off to the lab. And in this case, there is a fee involved, of course, a laboratory fee, which is currently about $25. It's probably going to increase over the next few years. But if you did nothing more than take a Secchi disc reading and get a phosphorus sample, you could learn a lot about a lake very quickly and relatively inexpensively.
Great. Well, thank you. Like I said, there are some more questions, and we will send those off to, hold on, I'm trying to multitask, which is never a good idea, but here we go. If you could definitely, we will definitely follow up with unanswered questions. Some of them were real simple about next training dates and things like that, and some of them were a little more complicated, but we'll get you a list of questions. For all the attendees, thank you so much for listening. We will be back next week with, like I mentioned, a presentation about wake boats. I also want to mention that Lake Stewards of Maine is hosting a webinar series starting this Friday at 4 o'clock. So visit their website for more information. it'll be a great series. It's going on all summer. So if you find yourself looking for something to do and hear more about Maine Lakes, log on to those webinars at 4 o'clock on Fridays. Check out our website if you'd like more information. Well, like I said, we'll send out the questions along with the recording. If you want to share it with anyone, friends, your lake association, you can do that. And then also when you leave this webinar, you'll be directed to a short, quick evaluation of the webinar, and we'd appreciate any feedback that we can get on that. So with that, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks, Roberta and Scott, for a great presentation.
Thank you.
I'm sure everyone learned a lot. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye.